The first sensation was the silk. It was the slide of impossibly soft, cool azure silk against her skin. Lian Sun's eyes flew open, her breath catching in a ragged gasp that was half a sob. Her hands, trembling, fisted in the delicate fabric of her bedspread. This wasn't the coarse shroud of a coffin. This was her bed. The one from her old life. Sunlight, gentle and golden, streamed through the latticed window of her bedchamber, illuminating dancing motes of dust in the air. It fell across the rosewood dressing table, her favorite brush set neatly arranged, and the scroll of a half-finished poem she'd been working on. The air smelled of sandalwood and the faint, sweet scent of the osmanthus blossoms from the garden below. It was the day. The memory of her death was not a gentle dream, it was a phantom pain, a cold poison still lingering in her veins. She could still taste the bitter dregs of the wine, feel the searing agony as it clawed its way through her, and the crushing weight of a shame she did not deserve. The echoing, hollow sound of her father's quiet weeping, the way her mother's vibrant spirit had been extinguished overnight, it all crashed over her like a tidal wave. Su Jian. His name was a curse on her lips. She saw his face, not the charming, scholarly mask he showed the world, but the panicked, calculating look in his eyes when they were caught. She heard his voice, clear as a bell, ringing with false sincerity in the crowded garden. "It's all my fault. It has nothing to do with Wanwan, I mean, Lian Sun. We are in love." He had used her name. Her good name, the reputation she and her family had spent a lifetime building, as a shield to protect his sordid little secret with that viper, by Mei Feng. And the world, so eager for scandal, had believed him. Why wouldn't they? The heir of Marquis Anping and the impeccable daughter of Minister Lian? It was a juicier story than the truth, a noble heir debasing himself with his own penniless cousin. A cold, sharp clarity, honed in the bitterness of the grave, settled over her. The migraine. That was the excuse she'd given yesterday, the reason she was supposed to stay in this very room today, unaware of the noose being tightened around her neck at the Empress Dowager's chrysanthemum banquet. A soft knock came at the door. "Young mistress? Are you awake?" It was Fei Lin, her head maid and lifelong companion. In her past life, Fei Lin had cried herself sick defending Lian Sun's honor to anyone who would listen. Lian Sun took a deep, steadying breath. The ghost was gone. The woman who rose from this bed was someone new. "Come in, Fei Lin." The door slid open. Fei Lin's kindly face was etched with concern. "Your headache, mistress, shall I prepare the willow bark tea and inform the palace you will not be attending the banquet?" "No," Lian Sun said, her voice surprisingly firm. She swung her legs out of bed, her feet meeting the cool, polished floor. "On the contrary, Fei Lin. I am feeling remarkably better. Draw me a bath. We are going to the banquet." Fei Lin blinked. "But, mistress, your health, and you said you found such events tedious." "A change of heart," Lian Sun replied, a faint, icy smile touching her lips. "I find I have a sudden, burning desire to see the chrysanthemums." An hour later, she stood before her full-length mirror, and even Fei Lin was staring, speechless. Lian Sun had not chosen one of her usual soft pastels or modest, high-necked gowns. She had chosen a dress of deep crimson, the color of pomegranates and fresh blood. It was cut in the latest, slightly daring fashion from the southern provinces, with wide sleeves embroidered with silver phoenixes and a sash that cinched her waist like a weapon. In her hair, instead of delicate jade pins, she wore a single, sharp hairpiece of polished obsidian, shaped like a dragon's claw. "You look formidable, mistress," Fei Lin finally whispered, a mix of awe and worry in her tone. "Good," Lian Sun said, meeting her own reflection's gaze. The eyes that stared back were not those of a gentle, sheltered maiden. They were the eyes of a general surveying a battlefield. That is the point. The journey to the palace was a blur. Every familiar street corner, every vendor's cry, was a poignant reminder of a world she had lost. She absorbed it all, the vibrant, chaotic life of Jingguang City, with a ferocious gratitude. "I am back. I am alive." The chrysanthemum banquet was in full swing within the sprawling imperial gardens. A sea of nobility in their finest silks moved amongst blooms of gold, white, and bronze. The air was thick with the scent of flowers, expensive perfume, and the low, cultured hum of gossip. As Lian Sun made her entrance, a subtle hush fell over the section of the crowd nearest the gate. Whispers trailed in her wake. "Is that Lian Sun? I heard she was ill." "She doesn't look ill." "That dress, quite a departure from her usual style." Stunning, though. Like a winter plum blossom suddenly bursting into flame. She ignored them, her gaze sweeping the crowd like a hawk. And there he was. Near the central pavilion, holding a cup of wine and laughing with a group of other young nobles, was Su Jian. He looked every inch the perfect heir, handsome, refined, exuding an air of effortless grace. Her stomach quailed with a cold, pure hatred. And then she saw her. By Mei Feng, hovering at the edge of Su Jian's group like a pale, delicate shadow. Dressed in humble white and sky blue, she was the picture of innocent fragility, her eyes downcast, a shy smile playing on her lips. The perfect victim. The perfect liar. Lian Sun's plan was simple: be seen, be undeniable, and shatter their narrative before it could even be spoken. She didn't approach them. Instead, she cut a path directly towards the one person in the garden whose power and sharp tongue made her largely immune to petty gossip, Princess Ling. The princess, a young woman with intelligent, dancing eyes, was holding court near a magnificent display of purple spider chrysanthemums. She raised an eyebrow as Lian Sun approached and executed a perfect, respectful bow. "Your Highness," Lian Sun said, her voice clear and carrying. "Lian Sun," Princess Ling replied, a slow, appreciative smile spreading across her face. "I heard you were languishing with a migraine. You seem to have found a remarkably potent cure. Crimson suits you. It looks like war paint." Lian Sun allowed a genuine, small smile to touch her own lips. "Perhaps it is, Your Highness. I simply decided that hiding in a dark room was a waste of such beautiful flowers, and such excellent company." Princess Ling laughed, a bright, genuine sound. "Well said. Come, tell me what you think of this poetry competition they're planning. I find the proposed themes dreadfully dull." They fell into easy, witty conversation. Lian Sun made sure her laughter was a little too loud, her presence a little too bright. She was a fixed point, an unmovable object. She was building her alibi in real time, weaving herself into the princess's formidable presence. It was then that she felt a prickling on the back of her neck, a sensation of being watched by someone other than Su Jian. She casually glanced around and her eyes snagged on a figure leaning against a gnarled old pine tree, slightly apart from the main crowd. Jin Feng. The young tiger of the north was watching her with an unnervingly direct gaze. He wasn't smiling. He looked analytical. Intrigued. He was dressed not in court silks, but in a dark, practical tunic edged with fur, his posture one of relaxed, predatory grace. He raised his wine cup to her in a silent, faintly mocking salute. Lian Sun's heart gave a single, hard thump. He was a variable she hadn't fully accounted for. In her past life, their paths had barely crossed. She gave him the barest nod of acknowledgement before turning back to Princess Ling, but the image of his sharp, knowing eyes was burned into her mind. The perfect, tranquil surface of the banquet was about to be shattered. She could feel it, the way one feels the pressure drop before a storm. She took a slow, deep breath, the scent of chrysanthemums and destiny filling her lungs. Let the play begin. The conversation with Princess Ling was a masterclass in social fencing. Lian Sun, who in her past life would have offered meek agreement or scholarly citations, now parried the princess's sharp wit with her own. She commented on the poetry themes not with dry analysis, but with a playful, slightly irreverent humor that made the princess chuckle. "You suggest we write about the loneliness of the autumn wind?" Lian Sun mused, tapping a finger against her chin. "Surely, Your Highness, that's been done to death by every melancholy scholar who ever failed the imperial exams. Why not the imperial audacity of the chrysanthemum, which blooms when all other flowers have fled the coming cold?" Princess Ling's eyes sparkled. Imperial audacity. I like that. It takes a certain arrogance to be so beautiful in the face of decay. Her gaze swept over Lian Sun's crimson dress meaningfully. "A sentiment you seem to understand intimately today, Miss Lian." It was precisely at this moment of connection, as Lian Sun had solidly anchored herself in the sphere of the most unassailable woman in the garden, that the carefully laid trap of her previous life sprung. A young maid, her face pale as parchment and her hands fluttering like startled birds, came rushing into their circle. She didn't go to the hostess, the Empress Dowager, but instead stumbled towards a cluster of matrons that included Lady Onping, Su Jian's mother. "Forgive me. Forgive this lowly one," the girl stammered, her voice a high-pitched thread of panic that cut through the murmur of conversation. I was taking tea to the West Pavilion for the musicians, and I I saw, a hush began to spread, rippling outwards from the epicenter of the maid's distress. Lady Omping's face, usually a mask of placid nobility, tightened. What did you see, girl? Control yourself. The maid took a gasping breath, playing her part perfectly. A young master and a lady. In a most compromising embrace. The screen was only half drawn. I dropped the tray. A wave of excited gasps and scandalized whispers swept through the crowd. This was the kind of delicious, illicit drama the nobility craved. Lady Omping's eyes darted immediately towards Lien Sun, a flicker of calculation and dread in their depths. It was the look she had given her in that other life, a look of resigned disappointment, already preparing to manage the fallout of her future daughter-in-law's indiscretion. But Lien Sun was not where she was supposed to be. She wasn't hovering nervously on the edges of the crowd. She was standing, calm and resplendent in her crimson, right beside Princess Ling. Su Jian chose that moment to make his entrance from the direction of the West Pavilion. His steps were hurried, his scholar's robes visibly disheveled, the sash tied haphazardly. His face was a masterpiece of contrived panic and shame. He looked directly at his mother, then let his gaze sweep the crowd as if searching for someone for her. His eyes found Lien Sun. For a split second, there was pure, unadulterated shock. It was there and gone in a flash, replaced by a mask of anguished guilt. He opened his mouth. This was the moment. This was when he would speak her name, bind her to his scandal forever. Lien Sun did not give him the chance. She took a single, deliberate step forward, the silver phoenixes on her sleeves catching the light. Her voice, cool and clear as a mountain stream, carried over the tense silence. How shocking, she said, not with outrage, but with a tone of lofty, almost bored disapproval. To defile the Empress Dowager's peaceful gardens with such vulgarity. Every eye swiveled to her. She turned slightly, including Princess Ling in her address. Your Highness, you are my witness. We have been here by the koi pond for quite some time, admiring the perseverance of the red and white carp, have we not? It seems we were fortunate to be entertained by nature's dignity, while others sought baser amusements. It was a devastatingly elegant move. She not only placed herself far from the scene of the crime but did so with an alibi that was royalty itself. Su Jian stood frozen, his mouth still agape. The script had been torn up. The name Lien Sun died on his lips, unsaid and now utterly unsayable. The crowd's murmur shifted in an instant. The anticipation of pointing fingers at the Minister of Rights' daughter evaporated, replaced by a new, hungry curiosity. If not Lien Sun, then who? Lady Omping's face went from tight to ashen. She understood the catastrophe instantly. Her son had been caught, and his intended shield had just become an immovable steel wall. It was Princess Ling who drove the next nail into the coffin. Indeed, we have, she affirmed, her voice dripping with regal authority. Miss Lien has been providing me with the most stimulating conversation of the afternoon. It seems our intellectual pursuits were far more engaging than whatever physical drama was unfolding in the West Pavilion. She turned a withering gaze on the stunned maid. This young lady you saw. Did you recognize her? The maid, terrified and confused by the sudden shift, could only shake her head. And no, Your Highness. She had her back to me. Then perhaps, Lien Sun suggested, her tone deceptively gentle, we should determine who is missing from our gathering. A quick accounting of the young ladies present might reveal who has strayed from the path. A flurry of activity followed. Mothers discreetly counted their daughters, and groups of young women looked around, their whispers now sharp with a new kind of excitement, the thrill of the hunt. It took less than a minute. Where is Bai Mei Feng? A voice piped up from the crowd. It was one of the young ladies who had been in Su Jian's orbit earlier. She was with Su a while ago, but I haven't seen her since. The name hung in the air, Bai Mei Feng. A distant cousin. A charity case. A nobody. The pieces clicked into place for everyone with devastating speed. The heir hadn't been with his prestigious, elegant fiancée. He'd been dallying with the poor, fragile cousin his family had taken in. The look on Su Jian's face was one of pure, undiluted horror. He had been prepared to sacrifice a queen to save a pawn, only to find the queen had checkmated him before he even moved. From her position by the pine tree, Lien Sun allowed her eyes to meet his. She didn't glare. She didn't smirk. She simply looked at him with an expression of profound, icy pity, the kind one might reserve for a bug crushed underfoot. It was a look that stripped him of his dignity far more effectively than any accusation could. Then, she turned her gaze to the crowd, her chin held high. The scandal remained, but its target had been irrevocably shifted. The story was no longer about the fall of the virtuous Lian Sun. It was about the sordid hypocrisy of the Anping heir. And at the center of it all, clad not in the white of mourning, but the victorious red of a phoenix, Lian Sun stood, unblemished and utterly, terrifyingly in control. The first battle was over. She had won. But as she felt the weight of a certain northern lord's gaze still upon her, she knew the war was just beginning. A silence thicker than imperial honey settled over the garden. The air, once fragrant with chrysanthemums, now tasted of rust and revelation. All eyes were pinned on Su Jian, who looked less like a refined scholar and more like a cornered animal, his disheveled state suddenly appearing not passionate, but pathetic. Lady Anping was the first to break, her voice a strangled hiss. "Jianer? Is this true?" Su Jian's mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. The lie he had prepared, the noble, if misguided, confession of love for Lian Sun was now a poison pill. To speak it would be to instantly brand himself both an adulterer and a fool. It was the Marquis of Anping himself, Su Jian's father, who finally acted. His face, usually a placid mask of aristocratic boredom, was dark with a thunderous rage that promised private retribution. He had seen the entire, carefully balanced future of his house, a union with the powerful Lian family, evaporate in the span of a minute. Enough of this spectacle, the Marquis boomed, his voice cutting through the whispers. He gestured sharply to two of his stern-faced retainers. "Check the West Pavilion. Now." The crowd held its collective breath as the men marched off. The tension was a physical thing, a wire stretched to its breaking point. Lian Sun did not look at the retreating guards. She kept her gaze fixed on Su Jian, her expression one of cool, clinical observation. She was studying the moment of his unraveling, committing every flinch, every bead of sweat on his temple, to memory. This was the justice her ghost had craved. The returnees did not take long. One of the guards approached the Marquis and murmured something low and succinct. The Marquis's shoulders slumped in a gesture of profound defeat. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, then nodded. He turned to the assembled nobility, his voice stripped of all its former authority, now just the tired rasp of a man managing his own ruin. "It would seem," he announced, the words dragged out of him, "the young lady in question is my ward, by Mei Feng." A synchronized gasp, then an explosion of chatter. "By Mei Feng? The cousin?" The story was infinitely more tawdry than anyone had imagined. This wasn't a romance between social equals, it was the heir debauching a dependent of his own household, a breach of trust so profound it bordered on the grotesque. As if on cue, Bai Meifeng herself appeared at the path leading from the West Pavilion, supported by one of the Anping maids. She was the picture of ruined innocence. Her hair was in disarray, her eyes red-rimmed and swimming with tears, and she clutched the edges of her simple blue robe together as if it were the only thing holding her together. She let out a soft, pathetic whimper as she saw the crowd, shrinking back as if from a blow. It was a masterful performance. But Lian Sun, who had seen the same act culminate in her own death, felt nothing but a cold, contemptuous fury. Su Jian, seeing his lover's distress, found his voice. "Father. Do not blame Meifeng. The fault is mine alone. I drank too much wine. I was not myself." It was a weak defense, the refuge of every scoundrel caught in the act. This was the moment. The moment for Lian Sun to strike her final, decisive blow. She took a single, graceful step forward, and the crowd parted for her. The crimson of her dress was a slash of vibrant judgment against the muted colors of the garden. "Heir Su," she began, her voice not raised, but so clear and carrying it silenced all other noise. She did not address him with anger, but with a pity so deep it was more insulting than any shout. "To think that you would use my name, the name of the woman you were supposedly courting, as a shield to cover your indiscretion with your own cousin. What a profoundly cowardly and dishonorable act." She let the words hang in the air, allowing everyone to absorb their full weight. She was not the jilted woman, she was the wronged party, stating facts from an unassailable moral high ground. "I had heard you were a man of learning and principle," she continued, shaking her head slowly, a gesture of profound disappointment that shamed him more effectively than any list of his sins. "It seems the scrolls you study did not impart the most basic lessons of decency. To sacrifice a woman's honor to save your own skin is the strategy of a cornered rat, not a noble heir." Su Jian flinched as if she had physically struck him. His face was a mask of humiliation and dawning horror. The crowd was eating it up, their stares shifting from scandalized curiosity to outright condemnation. Lian Sun then turned her gaze to the Marquis and Marchioness of Onping. She offered them a small, frigid bow. "My Lord Marquis. My lady. I thank you for your past kindness. But after today's revelations, I believe it is best for all concerned if the friendship between our houses ends here. The Lian family wishes to have nothing more to do with the House of Onping." With that, she publicly and permanently severed the tie. She had not just escaped their trap, she had set their own house on fire and walked away from the flames. She did not wait for a response. She turned, the obsidian claw in her hair glinting in the sun, and began to walk away from the wreckage. Her posture was straight, her head high. She did not look back at Su Jian's shattered expression or Bai Meifeng's tear-streaked face. She did not even glance at her parents, who she knew would be watching with a mixture of shock, fury, and immense relief. As she moved through the crowd, she passed by the gnarled pine tree. Jin Feng was still there, no longer leaning but standing straight. The mocking amusement was gone from his face, replaced by an expression of intense, unreadable focus. As she passed, his eyes met hers, and he gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't a salute of flirtation or mere approval. It was the acknowledgement of one strategist to another. A shiver, entirely different from the cold of the grave, traced its way down Lian Sun's spine. The game was far from over. She had won the battle against her past. But in doing so, she had just stepped onto a much larger, and far more dangerous, stage. The walk away from the chrysanthemum garden was the longest of Lian Sun's life, both in this existence and the last. The silence that trailed her was louder than any applause or condemnation. She could feel the weight of hundreds of stares, awestruck, calculating, sympathetic, envious, boring into the crimson silk of her back. She did not hurry. Each step was measured, a queen retreating from a battlefield she had unequivocally won. But a queen was still human. As she turned a corner, leaving the main spectacle behind and entering a quieter, shaded corridor that led to the palace's outer courtyards, the adrenaline that had sustained her began to leach away. The cold, controlled fury that had been her armor started to crack. Her hands, hidden in the wide sleeves of her dress, began to tremble. The phantom taste of poisoned wine rose in her throat, and for a terrifying second, the polished jade of the floor tiles looked like the cold stone of her tomb. She staggered, just slightly, her shoulder brushing against a painted pillar. She pressed her forehead to the cool, smooth wood, closing her eyes and fighting for breath. The images came unbidden, her mother's hair turning white overnight, her father's stoic frame crumbling during his morning court rituals, the whispered insults that had followed her like a shroud. The victory was real, but the wound was still raw and bleeding. "Impressive." The voice came from behind her, lazy and deep, cutting through her private turmoil. She knew who it was without turning. That voice, with its faint, rough-edged northern accent, was already etched into her new memory. She straightened slowly, composing her face into a mask of placid indifference before she turned to face him. Jin Feng leaned against the opposite pillar, his arms crossed, his posture the very picture of indolent amusement. But his eyes, those tiger-like eyes, missed nothing. She had the unnerving feeling he had seen her moment of weakness, had heard the silent scream echoing in her soul. "Young Master Jin," she said, her voice thankfully steady. "I did not take you for a man who enjoyed garden-variety gossip." His lips quirked. "I don't. But a masterfully executed political assassination set to the scent of flowers? That, I find fascinating." He pushed off the pillar and took a few steps closer. He wasn't as tall as Su Jian, but he carried a contained power that made him seem to occupy more space than he did. "You didn't just defend yourself. You dismantled him. You took his lie, sharpened it, and handed it back to him as a blade to fall on. It was elegant." Lian Sun's heart hammered against her ribs. He saw too much. "I merely stated facts. If Ersu chose to fall on his own sword, that is a consequence of his own poor character, not my doing." "Merely stated facts," he repeated, a genuine laugh rumbling in his chest. It was a pleasant sound, warm and entirely at odds with the cold tension thrumming through her. "You wield facts like my father's cavalry wields lances. It's a sight to behold." He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze dropping to the obsidian claw in her hair. "That's a northern piece. The craftsmanship. Meant to ward off evil spirits, or so they say." It seemed appropriate for the company today, she replied, her wit returning as her equilibrium did. He grinned, a flash of white teeth in his tanned face. It transformed him from a formidable observer into something dangerously appealing. Then, his expression sobered. He reached into a small pouch at his belt and pulled out something that looked like a dried, dark purple berry. Here, he said, holding it out to her. For the migraine you never had. She stared at his open palm. What is it? Snowpeak berry. From the northern mountains. Chew it. It clears the head and calms the nerves after. A performance. His eyes held hers, and the double meaning was clear. He knew her calm was a performance. He knew the cost. Hesitantly, she reached out and took the berry. Their fingers did not touch. She placed it on her tongue. It was tart, then sweet, with a cool, numbing sensation that spread instantly, soothing the frantic pulse at her temples. It was startlingly effective. How did you know? She asked quietly, the question escaping before she could stop it. That you weren't ill? He shrugged, a fluid, economical movement. A woman who plans to stay home with a headache doesn't choose a war dress and a dragon's claw. You came for a fight. I just didn't know it would be such a good one. He was far more perceptive than the rumors of a brutish military heir suggested. The stories painted him as all brawn and bluster, but the man before her was watching a complex game of Weiqi unfold where others only saw a garden party. Thank you for the berry, she said, the formal words feeling inadequate. Don't mention it, he said, waving a dismissive hand. Consider it an investment. An investment in what? In future entertainment, he said, his grin returning. The capital has been dreadfully dull. You, Miss Lien, have just made it infinitely more interesting. I look forward to seeing what you do next. With another nod, this one casual and familiar, he turned and strode down the corridor, his footsteps sure and silent on the jade tiles. He disappeared around a corner, leaving her alone with the lingering coolness of the berry on her tongue and the unsettling warmth of his attention. The encounter left her more off balance than the confrontation with Su Jian. Su Jian was a known quantity, a snake she had already learned to handle. Jin Feng was a storm on the horizon, unpredictable and powerful. He hadn't offered empty sympathy or fawning admiration. He'd offered a soldier's practical aid and a strategist's respect. It was disarming. As she finally made her way to the waiting Lien family carriage, the full weight of the day's events settled upon her. She had saved her reputation. She had shattered Su Jian's. She had avenged her past life's humiliation. But as the carriage pulled away from the palace, she looked out the window at the bustling, unknowing city. The ghost of Lien Sun was finally at peace. But the woman who remained now lived in a world where she had made an enemy of a marquis family and attracted the focused interest of a duke's heir. Her freedom was won, but her safety was far from guaranteed. The battle was over, but the war for her future had just begun. And for the first time since she had opened her eyes that morning, she felt not the cold grip of fear, but the thrilling, terrifying quickening of anticipation. The silence of the Lien family carriage was a sanctuary. Lien Sun leaned her head back against the cushioned seat, the lingering coolness of the Snowpeak berry a phantom comfort on her tongue. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. She had done it. She had rewritten her fate. But as the carriage wheels clattered over the cobblestones of Jingguang City, she knew the real work was just beginning. A public scandal of that magnitude did not simply end, it rippled outward, twisting and distorting as it traveled through the intricate web of high society. The first ripple arrived before she had even changed out of her crimson dress. Her mother, Lady Lien, swept into her chambers, her face a mask of controlled panic. Sooner. We heard, the servants are saying, is it true? Su Jian and that Bai girl? And you confronted them? Behind her, Lien Kaido, the Minister of Rights, stood with his hands clasped behind his back. His expression was grim, but his eyes, usually so reserved, held a flicker of something fierce and proud. It is true, Mother, Lien Sun said, her voice calm. She gave a concise, unemotional account of the events, omitting only the strange encounter with Jin Feng. When she finished, her mother sank onto a divan, fanning herself rapidly. Heaven above. To think we considered that snake for a son-in-law. Your father was just finalizing the betrothal documents. Lien Kaido finally spoke, his voice a low rumble. The documents are now ash. He looked at his daughter. You conducted yourself with a courage and wisdom that shames many seasoned courtiers, sooner. You have saved this family from a disastrous alliance. The approval in his voice was a balm. This was what she had fought for, not just her own life, but the light in her parents' eyes. But the gossip, Kaito. Lady Lien fretted. They will paint her as heartbroken, or worse, complicit. The gossip, Lien Kaito said with a minister's cool logic, will follow the more interesting story. The fall of the Omping heir is a far richer feast for vultures than the bruised feelings of my daughter. We will say nothing. Silence is the highest form of contempt. It was a sound strategy. But Lien Sun knew that in the court of public opinion, silence could also be interpreted as confirmation. The second ripple came the next day, delivered by a furious Fei Lin. Mistress. It's vile. That creature, by Mei Feng, is spreading lies. Lien Sun looked up from her inkstone, where she was practicing her calligraphy with a newfound ferocity. What lies? Fei Lin wrung her hands. She's telling anyone who will listen that you were so distraught over Ersu's rejection that you've thrown yourself at the young tiger of the north. She says you were seen in a clandestine meeting with him after the banquet, that you are using him to make Su Jian jealous. She calls you desperate and shameless. Lien Sun's hand stilled. So, the viper had struck from the grass. It was a clever, poisonous twist. It sought to undermine her victory, to recast her strategic defiance as the hysterical flailing of a jilted woman. It also deliberately targeted her new, and most dangerous, acquaintance. A cold smile touched Lien Sun's lips. Denial would be weak. Ignoring it would be conceding. She needed a countermove that was not a defense, but a superior offense. An opportunity arrived 2 days later, a poetry contest hosted by Princess Ling at her lakeside pavilion. It was the first major social gathering since the chrysanthemum banquet, and the air was thick with unspoken questions and sidelong glances directed at Lien Sun. She arrived dressed not in the victorious red of before, but in a gown of deep, stormy blue, embroidered with silver cranes in flight. It was a statement of elegant, untouchable grace. Princess Ling greeted her with a knowing look. I trust you have brought your imperial audacity with you today, Miss Lien, the princess murmured. The hyenas are circling. The theme for the contest, announced by the princess, was the unlooked-for season. It was a provocatively open-ended theme, and Lien Sun knew it was a test, set specifically for her. One by one, young masters and ladies presented their verses. They spoke of unexpected winter frosts, of summer rains and spring. Their poems were technically proficient and utterly safe. Then, it was Lien Sun's turn. She rose, a scroll in her hand. The pavilion fell silent. Every eye was on her. She could see Su Jian, seated with a sullen group of his remaining friends, his face a thundercloud. She could feel the weight of the crowd's expectation. She unrolled the scroll, her voice clear and melodic, carrying over the still lake water. They whisper of a tiger's roar, in valleys where I never strayed. They claim I seek a foreign shore, by a northern star, unmade. A ripple went through the audience. This was not a denial. This was an acknowledgement. She was addressing the rumor head-on. They do not see the sun's new track, the ice that melts, the dormant seed. They only see the turning back on a blighted, withered weed. Her gaze did not flicker toward Su Jian, but the meaning was as clear as glass. The past was a blighted weed. She had turned her back. Let them chatter, let them stare, at a path they cannot see. For the truest season, rare and fair, is the one that sets you free. She finished, and for a moment, there was only the sound of the wind over the water. Then, Princess Ling began to applaud, a slow, deliberate clap. The spell was broken, and a wave of genuine, impressed applause followed. She had not denied the connection to Jin Feng. She had reframed it. She had taken Bai Meifeng's tawdry gossip and transformed it into a soaring declaration of independence and self-determination. The Northern Star was no longer a desperate rebound, it was a symbol of a new, uncharted destiny. As she sat down, her heart pounding not with anxiety, but with triumph, a movement at the edge of the pavilion caught her eye. Jin Feng stood there, leaning against a wooden post, having arrived unnoticed. He wasn't looking at the crowd or the princess. He was looking directly at her. His arms were crossed, and on his face was not the lazy amusement of the palace corridor, but an expression of intense, arrested focus. He had heard the poem. He had heard her call him a northern star. He held her gaze for a long, charged moment. Then, the corner of his mouth lifted in a slow, predatory, and deeply appreciative smile. The rumor was no longer a lie spun by an enemy. It was a challenge, laid at his feet by the most intriguing woman in the empire. And judging by the fire in his eyes, it was a challenge he had every intention of accepting. The morning after the poetry contest, a different kind of tension hummed in the Lien household. The servants moved with a hushed reverence around Lien's son, their glances a mixture of awe and curiosity. Her poem was already being recited in tea houses, and the narrative was shifting. She was no longer the pitiable, jilted maiden, but a figure of formidable intellect and audacious spirit. It was in this charged atmosphere that Jin Feng came calling. He did not arrive with the subtlety of a suitor, but with the unmistakable fanfare of the Duke of Jinbei's household. A sleek, dark-lacquered carriage bearing the Duke's crest, a roaring tiger picked out in gold, pulled up to the Lien residence. Jin Feng himself stepped out, dressed not in court silks, but in a tailored riding outfit of dark green, his boots dusty from the road. He carried an air of unapologetic purpose. Lien Kaido received him in the main reception hall, his expression impeccably neutral. Young Master Jin. To what do we owe this unexpected honor? Jin Feng executed a perfect, respectful bow. Minister Lien. I come to speak with you on a matter of mutual benefit. And, with your permission, I wish to pay my respects to your daughter. The request was bold, bypassing all conventional courtship rituals. Yet, coming from the heir of the most powerful military family in the empire, it carried a weight that could not be easily dismissed. Lien Sun was summoned. She entered the hall, having chosen a gown of muted lavender, a color of contemplation and grace. She saw Jin Feng standing before her father, and the sheer masculine energy of him seemed to make the spacious room feel smaller. Miss Lien, Jin Feng said, his gaze sweeping over her. There was no mockery in his eyes today, only a sharp, businesslike assessment. Your poem was illuminating. Thank you, young Master Jin, she replied, her tone equally measured. I find clarity often comes when one stops listening to the whispers of others. A faint smile touched his lips. Precisely. He turned back to her father. Minister Lien, the whispers, however, are the problem. For both our houses. He proceeded with a soldier's directness. My father is eager to see me wed. The Grand Duke believes a wife will settle me. The courtly ladies presented to me are. He waved a dismissive hand, like decorative songbirds. They would wilt within a week in the north, and their constant chirping about poetry and embroidery would drive me to distraction. He then gestured toward Lien Sun. Your daughter, on the other hand, has just publicly and spectacularly demonstrated that she is neither a songbird nor a wilting flower. She has a spine of steel and a mind as sharp as a general's sword. The rumor mills, thanks to that viper in the Onping household, have already linked our names. They paint her as desperate and me as a brute. It is a narrative that serves neither of us. Lien Kaido's eyes narrowed. What are you proposing, young Master Jin? I propose a temporary alliance, Jin Feng stated, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. A public courtship. We will be seen together. We will give the gossips a new, controlled story to feast on. For you, Miss Lien, it will silence the talk of heartbreak and elevate your status. Who would dare pity a woman being courted by the young tiger of the north? For me, it will placate my father and keep the simpering songbirds at bay. He looked directly at Lien's son, his gaze intense. It is a contract. A strategic maneuver. We present a unified front. In return, you have my name, my family's protection, and the freedom from any other unwanted suitors who might see your recent independence as an opportunity. The audacity of it took Lien Sun's breath away. It was brilliant. It was cold. It was exactly the kind of move she would have devised herself. And when this temporary alliance has served its purpose, she asked, her voice cool. What then? Jin Feng shrugged, a fluid, powerful motion. Then, we stage a mutually agreeable parting of ways. A discovery of irreconcilable differences. You retire, having been courted by a duke's heir, your reputation not just restored, but gilded. I return to the border, a man who tried the comforts of courtly life and found it lacking. We both get what we want. The silence in the hall was profound. Lien Kaido studied Jin Feng, his minister's mind weighing the risks and rewards. The protection of the Jinbei dukedom was a formidable shield. The potential backlash if the ruse was discovered was equally formidable. Lien Sun met Jin Feng's tiger-like stare. This was not the fated romance of storybooks. It was a pact between two predators. He offered her a sword and a shield, and in return, he asked for her wit as his armor against the petty politics of the capital. He saw her not as a woman to be cherished, but as a partner in a campaign. And after the betrayal of Su Jian, that honest, transactional proposal was strangely refreshing. "Father," she said, turning to Lien Kaido. "Young Master Jin's proposal, while unorthodox, has merit. It is a solution born of logic, not sentiment. I am willing to entertain this alliance." Lien Kaido looked from his daughter's resolute face to the young lord's confident one. He saw the same ruthless intelligence in both their eyes. He sighed, a sound of surrender to the inevitable. "Very well," the minister said. "A 3-month courtship. Public, but chaperoned. The terms of the dissolution will be agreed upon in writing, discreetly." Jin Feng bowed again, a glint of triumph in his eyes. "Thank you, Minister Lien." He then offered his arm to Lien Sun. "Miss Lien? I am told the new lotus blossoms in the Imperial Gardens are particularly stunning this morning. Shall we give the capital its first chapter?" She placed her hand lightly on his arm. The contact was electric, a jolt of pure, unsettling energy. His forearm was solid as granite beneath the fine fabric of his sleeve. "By all means, young Master Jin," she said, her smile a carefully crafted work of art. "Let us go and paint our picture." As they walked out of the Lien residence together, the eyes of the servants and the ever-watchful street gossips were upon them. The message was sent not with a shout, but with a simple, coordinated stroll. The brilliant, scandal-adjacent daughter of the Minister of Rights and the formidable heir of the Jinbei dukedom were an item. Sitting in the Jinbei carriage, the silence between them was different from the one in the palace corridor. It was the silence of two chess masters who have just agreed to play the same side. "You know," Jin Feng said, breaking the quiet as he watched the city scroll by, "for this to be convincing, you might have to stop looking at me as if I'm a tactical problem to be solved." Lien Sun kept her gaze forward. "And you might have to stop looking at me as if I'm a new and interesting siege engine." He laughed, that warm, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the carriage. "But you are, Miss Lien. You are the most fascinating piece of artillery I've ever encountered." Despite herself, a genuine smile threatened to break through her composure. This alliance, she realized with a start, might not be the cold, clinical contract she had imagined. It was starting to feel suspiciously like fun. The courtship began with a series of carefully orchestrated public appearances. They visited the Imperial Gardens, strolling just slowly enough for the gossips to note their apparent ease with one another. They attended a public lecture on military history, where Jin Feng asked pointed questions that flustered the elderly scholar, and Lien Sun followed up with such incisive commentary that the entire debate shifted. They were a spectacle, a duo that captivated the capital. The story of the heartbroken maiden was well and truly dead, replaced by awe at this power couple in the making. In private, their dynamic was a strange, exhilarating dance. Their conversations were a constant, witty duel. "Your method of choosing fabrics is as strategic as a troop deployment," Jin Feng observed one afternoon, watching her deliberate between two silks for a new gown. "And your appreciation for pastries is as focused as a cavalry charge," Lien Sun retorted, noting how he'd single-mindedly devoured a plate of honeyed walnut cakes. He made her laugh, a real, unguarded laugh that startled her with its frequency. She, in turn, impressed him with her knowledge of northern border treaties, knowledge she'd secretly cultivated in her past life to try and connect with Su Jian, who had feigned interest. With Jin Feng, the interest was fiercely genuine. "You've read General Hu's treatise on desert warfare?" he'd asked, his eyebrows raised in surprise during a carriage ride. "The chapter on securing water sources is fundamentally flawed," she'd replied coolly. "He prioritizes centralized control, but in shifting sands, distributed, hidden caches are more resilient." He had stared at her for a long moment before a slow grin spread across his face. "I've been saying that for years. My father called me a reckless boy." It was during one of these outings, a visit to a temple on the outskirts of the city to seek blessings for their future, that Lien Sun first felt the prickle of true danger. As their party ascended the stone steps, she caught a glimpse of a sullen, familiar face in the crowd of vendors and pilgrims below. It was one of Su Jian's former hangers-on, a minor noble's son known for his brutishness and debts. His eyes were fixed on her with a venom that felt personal. She mentioned it to no one, dismissing it as paranoia. The Su family was disgraced, their influence waning. What could they do? She underestimated the desperation of a cornered snake and the specific, festering hatred of a woman like Bai Mei Feng. The plan was crude but effective. A few nights later, a commotion erupted in the quiet lane beside the Lien family walls. Shouts, the clang of steel, and a single, choked-off cry shattered the stillness. Lien Sun, reading by her window, froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was not a coincidence. Before panic could fully take root, a firm, rhythmic knock came at her chamber door. Fei Lin opened it, her face pale. A man stood there, one of Jin Feng's personal guards, a northern soldier with a scar across his cheek and eyes as cold as glacier ice. He bowed. "Miss Lien. The young master requests your presence in the main hall." "The matter is settled." Trembling slightly, Lien Sun followed him. In the main reception hall, her father stood in his night robe, his face a mask of fury. At his feet lay a man, bound and gagged, his face bruised and bleeding. It was the same brutish nobleman she had seen at the temple. And standing over him, still dressed in his day clothes as if he had never left his post, was Jin Feng. He wasn't looking at the captive. His gaze was fixed on Lien Sun, and the expression in his eyes made her blood run cold. It was no longer the look of an amused strategist or a contractual partner. It was the flat, deadly gaze of a tiger that had just tasted blood. "He talked," Jin Feng said, his voice dangerously quiet. "It seems the former heir Su's beloved cousin was not content with her diminished circumstances. She hired this trash and his friends to not just kidnap you, but to ensure you were unable to marry above your station before they dumped you outside the city gates." The horror of it washed over Lien Sun, so visceral she had to reach for a chair. Bai Mei Feng hadn't just wanted to ruin her, she had wanted to destroy her, to break her body and spirit so completely that even Jin Feng's alliance would be rendered meaningless. "The others?" Lien Kaito asked, his voice tight. "My men are detaining them," Jin Feng said, the euphemism laced with unspoken violence. "They will not trouble you again." He finally turned his gaze to the bound man. "This one, I brought as proof." He then stepped toward Lien Sun, his movements precise, controlled. He knelt on one knee before her chair, bringing his eyes level with hers. The gesture was one of profound fealty, shocking in its intimacy. "This is my failure," he said, his voice low, for her ears only. "I knew the threat was there. I placed guards, but I did not anticipate the depth of their depravity soon enough." Lien Sun stared at him, the reality of the situation crashing down. He hadn't just happened upon this. He had been having her watched, protected, since the moment their alliance began. The contract was a piece of paper, this was action. This was a shield made of flesh and will. "You," she whispered. "You were watching the house?" "I was watching you," he corrected, his gaze unwavering. "No one harms what is mine." The words were the same as in the garden, but now they held a different, terrifying weight. They were no longer part of a performance. They were a vow. He stood, his focus returning to her father. "Minister Lien, with your permission, I will handle the disposal of this garbage and see that a full confession, implicating Bai Mei Feng, is delivered to the magistrate by dawn. The Su family will have one last scandal to choke on." Lien Kaito could only nod, his anger now mixed with a dawning respect for the young man who operated not with courtly whispers, but with decisive, brutal efficiency. Jin Feng turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. He looked back at Lien Sun, the killer's glint in his eyes softening into something else, something fiercely protective. "Get some rest," he said. "The game has changed. From now on, we play by my rules." As he strode out, taking the bound man and the shadow of the night's violence with him, Lien Sun sat in the sudden quiet of the hall. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But coiling alongside it was something new, something powerful and warm. Their alliance had been forged in the cool logic of mutual benefit. But tonight, it had been tempered in fire and blood. It was no longer just convenient. It was real. And the man she had agreed to a contract with was not just a strategic partner. He was a force of nature who had just drawn a line in the sand around her, and she had never felt so terrifyingly, exhilaratingly safe. The Imperial Hunt was a spectacle of raw power and pageantry. The forest reserve echoed with the baying of hounds, the blare of horns, and the thunder of hooves. The nobility, clad in practical but expensive hunting leathers, were a sea of earthy tones against the vibrant autumn foliage. At the center of it all, the emperor himself sat beneath a grand canopy, observing his subjects with a benign, paternal air. Lian Sun, dressed in a riding habit of deep forest green, sat astride a graceful dappled mare. Beside her, Jin Feng was a study and contained ferocity atop a massive black warhorse that seemed to scent battle on the wind. Their courtship was now the accepted reality of the season, and today, they were the undisputed stars of the hunt. "It's a fine day for a ride," Jin Feng remarked, his eyes scanning the tree line not for game, but for threats. The confession from Bai Meifeng's hired thug had been delivered, causing a final, seismic shockwave through the Su family. The Marquis of Anping, in a last-ditch effort to salvage anything, had publicly disowned Bai Meifeng and sent her to a remote monastery. But the stain was permanent. The air around the Su contingent was thick with humiliation and simmering rage. "Indeed," Lian Sun replied, her voice calm. She could feel Su Jian's gaze from across the field, a hot, bitter brand. "Though some of the prey seems more interested in the hunters than the hunt." Jin Feng followed her glance and his lips curled. "Let him look. A cornered fox is only dangerous if you step into its den." He leaned over, his voice dropping. "Stay close to me once we're in the woods." The hunt began. The party streamed into the forest, a chaotic, joyous charge. Lian Sun and Jin Feng rode together, a synchronized unit. He pointed out animal tracks, explaining the subtleties of the chase, and she, in turn, identified edible plants and sources of fresh water, her knowledge from scrolls surprising him anew. For a few hours, the tension eased. The thrill of the chase, the beauty of the forest, and the easy, unforced camaraderie between them felt real. Lian Sun found herself laughing genuinely as Jin Feng's arrow neatly took down a plump pheasant, and he looked inordinately pleased when she correctly predicted the path of a fleeing deer. It was during the archery contest, a display of skill held in a large clearing, that the fragile piece shattered. The targets were set up, and nobles took turns showcasing their prowess. Su Jian's turn came. His shot was perfect, as always a clean hit in the center of the target. But as he lowered his bow, his eyes, dark and haunted, found Lian Sun in the crowd. The applause died in her ears. The look in his eyes wasn't just hatred, it was the frantic, shattered glare of a man with nothing left to lose. As the next archer stepped up, a commotion near the target line spooked a riderless horse. It reared, whinnying in panic, and bolted straight towards the spectators. There was a moment of confused shouting, a surge of movement. In that chaotic split second, as all eyes were on the panicked horse, Su Jian acted. He knocked another arrow, his movements a blur of desperate fury. But he didn't aim at the target. He swung his bow, the arrow pointing directly at Lian Sun. "Sooner!" The cry was torn from her father's throat. Time seemed to slow. Lian Sun saw the glint of the arrowhead, saw the murderous intent on Su Jian's face. There was no time to move, no time to scream. Then a wall of solid muscle and dark green leather slammed into her, wrenching her from the saddle. Jin Feng. He moved with an impossible speed, wrapping his body around hers as they tumbled from her horse onto the soft, leaf-strewn ground. A sickening thwack followed by a sharp, pained grunt. The world swam back into focus. Lian Sun was on the ground, cushioned by Jin Feng's body. He was above her, his face a mask of cold fury, but his right arm was pinned awkwardly beneath them. Protruding from the leather of his upper arm, just below the shoulder, was Su Jian's arrow. A dark, crimson stain was already spreading through the fabric. He had taken the arrow meant for her. Chaos erupted. Guards swarmed Su Jian, disarming him and dragging him away as he screamed her name, a litany of blame and madness. The emperor was on his feet, his face like thunder. Lian Sun scrambled out from under Jin Feng, her hands flying to the wound. "You're hit." "It's a scratch," he gritted out, though his face was pale. His left hand came up to grip hers, which was pressed against the arrow shaft. His touch was shockingly warm. "Are you hurt?" "You idiot," she cried, her composure shattered, tears she didn't know she was holding back springing to her eyes. "You were supposed to push me out of the way, not use yourself as a shield." A ghost of his usual smirk touched his lips, though it was tight with pain. "My methods are thorough." The imperial physicians rushed over. As they carefully cut away the leather to assess the damage, the emperor approached, his presence silencing the clearing. "Young Master Jin." "Miss Lian." The emperor's voice was low, but it carried the weight of the empire. He looked at the arrow in Jin Feng's arm, then at the narrow-strained Su Jian, who was sobbing incoherently. "We have witnessed everything." He turned his gaze to the disgraced Marquis of Onping, who had fallen to his knees. An attempt on the life of the daughter of our Minister of Rights. An assault on the heir of Jinbei. In our very presence. The Emperor's eyes were cold. Marquis Onping. Your line's honor is extinguished. Your title is revoked, your lands forfeit. You and your household will depart the capital by sundown and return to your ancestral village, where you will live out your days in obscurity. Your son will be held for trial, and his fate will match his crime. It was a death sentence for the family's name. The Onping lineage was over. As the physicians tended to Jin Feng, pronouncing the wound clean but deep, Lian Sun never left his side. Her hand remained in his, their contractual alliance forgotten in the stark reality of blood and sacrifice. He looked up at her, his tiger's eyes soft for the first time. You called me an idiot, he murmured, for her alone. You are, she whispered, her voice thick. A magnificent, brave, and utterly foolish idiot. He squeezed her hand. The contract, he said, his voice weak but intent. Forget the contract. Lian Sun's breath caught. This, he said, gesturing faintly between them with his good hand, his gaze dropping to their joined hands, then back to her tear-streaked face. This is not a performance anymore. The world, with all its noise and chaos, faded away. In that moment, there was only the truth in his eyes, the warmth of his hand, and the profound, terrifying, exhilarating realization that the game was over. Something real had taken its place. She leaned closer, her forehead almost touching his. No, she agreed, her voice steady now, sure. It's not. The world narrowed to the hushed confines of the Lian family's best guest chamber. The scent of medicinal poultices and blood hung in the air, a stark contrast to the forest's clean, autumn smell. Jin Feng lay propped up on a mountain of silk pillows, his torso bare save for the stark white bandages swathing his upper arm and shoulder. The physician had left, pronouncing the young tiger lucky the arrow had missed bone and major vessels, but the muscle damage was severe, and the pain would be fierce. Lian Sun dismissed the hovering servants with a quiet word. The door clicked shut, leaving them in a silence that was thick and heavy with everything left unsaid. She stood by the window, her back to him, watching the afternoon light gild the courtyard. Her green riding habit was smudged with dirt and a dark, rust-colored stain where his blood had seeped onto her sleeve. She could still feel the phantom impact of his body slamming into hers, the terrifying sight of the arrow protruding from his arm, the warmth of his blood on her hands. The physician said you need rest, she said, her voice unnaturally calm. The physician talks too much. Jin Feng's voice was a low rasp, weakened but still threaded with its characteristic defiance. Come here. It wasn't a request. It was a quiet command, one that brooked no argument. She turned slowly. In the soft light of the chamber, he looked younger, the usual sharp edges of his demeanor softened by pain and exhaustion. But his eyes, those tiger's eyes, burned with an intensity that stole the air from her lungs. You're hovering, he said. It's unnerving. The Lian Sun I know faces things head-on. She walked to the side of his bed, her steps silent on the plush rug. She looked down at him, at the stark evidence of his sacrifice. You could have died. A calculated risk, he said, his lips quirking in a pale imitation of his usual smirk. My shoulder is a far less vital target than your heart. The double meaning hung between them, palpable and electric. Why? The word was a whisper, torn from the deepest, most vulnerable part of her. It was the question she had been asking since the moment they hit the ground. The contract, it never stipulated this. Taking an arrow was not part of the terms. Jin Feng's gaze was unwavering. Forget the contract, Lian Sun. I told you. It's ash. I burned it in my mind the moment I saw that bastard draw his bow on you. He tried to shift, a flicker of pain tightening his features. She instinctively reached out, her hand hovering over his bandaged arm before she pulled it back, unsure. He caught her retreating hand with his good one. His grip was firm, his skin calloused and warm. He laced his fingers through hers, a simple, devastatingly intimate gesture. I did it, he said, his voice dropping, because the thought of a world without you in it was unacceptable. He looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face, his expression laid bare. I did it because somewhere between you shaming Su Jian in that garden and you debating military strategy in my carriage, this stopped being a game for me. Lian Sun's heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, frantic bird. The last of her defenses, the wall she had built so meticulously since her rebirth, crumbled to dust. There was no strategy here, no calculation. Only raw, unvarnished truth. This, she began, her voice trembling. This is not the agreement we made. No, he agreed, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. This is a new one. And I'm proposing its terms now. He took a slow, pained breath. Term 1, no more pretending. What I feel for you is not a performance. And what do you feel? She dared to ask, her eyes searching his. Respect, he said without hesitation. Ah. A desperate, maddening need to be near you, to hear your mind at work, to see that fire in your eyes. He gave a short, pained laugh. Call it love, if you're brave enough. I am. The word, so bluntly spoken, seemed to echo in the quiet room. Love. It was not the flowery, poetic love of scholars. It was a declaration, stark and powerful as a mountain crag. Term 2, he continued, his gaze fierce. This is not a temporary alliance. This is a lifetime. I am not asking you to marry me for convenience. I am asking you to rule the Northern Territories by my side, to be my partner in every sense of the word. To build a dynasty with me. Lian Sun felt dizzy. A lifetime. A dynasty. It was everything she had never allowed herself to want, offered by the one man who saw her not as a prize or a pawn, but as an equal. And term 3, she whispered, her fingers tightening around his. A slow, genuine smile, the most beautiful she had ever seen, spread across his face. Term 3, he said, his voice dropping to a husky murmur. You have to say yes. Tears, this time not of fear but of overwhelming, incandescent joy, finally spilled down her cheeks. She brought their joined hands to her lips and pressed a soft, fervent kiss to his knuckles. Then yes, she said, her voice clear and strong, all tremor gone. Yes to your new terms. Yes to no more pretending. Yes to a lifetime. She leaned down, until her forehead rested against his, her tears mingling with the sweat on his skin. Yes to you, Jean Fong. He lifted his good arm, his hand cupping the back of her neck, pulling her the last inch until her lips met his. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a claiming, a seal, a promise. It tasted of medicine and blood and the salt of her tears, and underneath it all, the pure, sweet flavor of a future she had fought for, died for, and been reborn to claim. It was the end of a carefully constructed lie and the breathtaking beginning of a terrifying, magnificent truth. When they finally parted, both breathless, he kept his forehead pressed against hers, his eyes closed. Good, he breathed. Now, about my next campaign, she laughed, a watery, joyful sound. You are insufferable. I'm bedridden, he corrected, opening his eyes, which now sparkled with triumphant mischief. I have to make my entertainment somehow. And convincing you was the most important battle of my life. Outside the chamber door, the Lien household, and soon the entire capital, would buzz with the news of the assassination attempt, the fall of the Onping family, and the profound heroism of the young tiger. But inside that quiet room, none of that mattered. There was only the two of them, and the unwritten contract of their hearts, signed in blood and sealed with a kiss. The wedding of Lian Sun and Jean Feng was not merely a social event, it was an imperial proclamation. The empress herself, delighted by the union of her formidable nephew with the woman who had captivated the capital, declared it a celebration of the empire's finest virtues, courage, intellect, and unwavering loyalty. The betrothal gifts from the Jinbei dukedom filled the Lian family courtyards, not just gold and silks, but furs from ice bears, swords of folded northern steel, and a live, white gerfalcon, a symbol of the wild, free skies Jean Feng promised to share with her. On the day she married, Lian Sun did not wear the traditional, blushing red of a new bride. At Jean Feng's request, she wore the deep, stormy blue of the gown she had worn to the poetry contest, the color of her independence, embroidered now not with cranes, but with intertwined dragons and tigers in silver and gold thread. It was a dress that spoke not of a girl leaving her home, but of a queen ascending to her throne. As she knelt with him in the grand hall of the Jinbei mansion in the capital, performing the rites before the emperor and empress, her heart was not filled with the nervous trepidation of a new bride, but with a profound, steady certainty. When their eyes met as they shared the ceremonial cup of wine, it was a look of equals, of partners. The contract was forgotten, the vow was everything. The celebrations lasted for days, but for Lian Sun and Jean Feng, their true life began when they left the capital. The journey north was a revelation. The manicured gardens and placid canals of Jingguang City gave way to rolling hills, then to soaring, pine-clad mountains and vast, open skies that seemed to go on forever. The air grew crisp and sharp, carrying the scent of snow and pine resin. Jin Feng, his arm still in a sling but his spirit untamed, pointed out landmarks from his horse, riding alongside her carriage. "That ridge is where my father's cavalry routed the western tribes," he'd shout over the wind. "That river runs so cold in winter, it can freeze a man's lungs if he breathes too deeply." He was in his element, and Lian Sun, watching him, felt a love that was as vast and wild as the landscape. This was not the constrained world of courtly whispers she had been reborn into. This was a world she could help build. Their arrival at the Jinbei fortress, a colossal structure of dark stone that seemed to grow from the mountains themselves, was met not by bowing courtiers, but by a thunderous roar from the assembled northern garrison. These were not polished capital guards, these were hardened warriors with scars and fierce grins, who respected blood and steel above bloodlines. Jin Feng dismounted and, before them all, turned and offered his hand to help Lian Sun from the carriage. It was a simple gesture, but in the context of this martial court, it was deeply significant. He was presenting her not as a decorative accessory, but as his counterpart. "Men of the north," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "This is your new mistress. Lian Sun of the sharp mind and the sharper spirit. The woman who faced down a coward's arrow and helped me bring down a corrupt house. You will afford her the same loyalty you afford me, for her word is my word." A moment of stunned silence was followed by an even louder, more enthusiastic roar. They recognized strength. And in Lian Sun's calm, observant gaze as she stood beside their young tiger, they saw it in abundance. Months flowed into a year. The young mistress of the north quickly became its uncrowned queen. While Jin Feng managed the military drills and border patrols, Lian Sun took over the fortress's staggering domestic affairs. She reorganized the grain stores with an efficiency that left the old stewards gaping. She opened a school for the soldiers' children, arguing that a literate populace was a loyal and productive one. She sat in on Jin Feng's war councils, and her insights on supply lines and diplomatic outreach were soon considered indispensable. One evening, they stood together on the high ramparts, watching the sun set behind the jagged mountain peaks, painting the snow in shades of rose and gold. Lian Sun was wrapped in a cloak of white fox fur, a gift from Jin Feng after she had successfully negotiated a new trade treaty with a previously hostile mountain clan. "A message from the capital," Jin Feng said, pulling a scroll from his belt. "From Princess Ling," he grinned. "She says the court is dreadfully dull without you. And she sends news of the lingering ghost." Lian Sun leaned against him, his solid warmth a constant comfort against the northern chill. "Su Jian?" His family's exile procession was seen passing through a border town. Ragged. Broken. He was said to be staring into nothing, muttering to himself. Jin Feng's voice held no triumph, only a final, dismissive closure. "He is a ghost. And ghosts belong to the past." Lian Sun felt the last, cold shard of her past life finally melt away. There was no hatred, no lingering fear. Only pity for the man who had chosen a path of petty deceit, and profound gratitude for the twist of fate that had given her a second chance. She looked up at her husband, at the man who had seen the weapon in her wit and the queen in her courage. "Do you ever miss the capital?" she asked. He looked down at her, his tiger's eyes soft in the twilight. "I have everything I could ever want right here," he said, his voice low and sure. "A stronghold to defend, a people to lead, and a wife who is my equal in every way. This is the dynasty I wanted to build. Our dynasty." He cupped her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. "You are not just my wife, Lian Sun. You are my partner. My northern star." Below them, in the fortress courtyard, soldiers laughed by a bonfire, and the sounds of the schoolchildren singing their lessons drifted on the wind. It was a world of their own making, built on respect, forged in sacrifice, and destined to endure. As his lips met hers under the vast, star-dusted sky of the north, Lian Sun knew with absolute certainty that the girl who had drunk poisoned wine in a gilded cage was truly gone. In her place stood a woman, reborn not for revenge, but for a legacy. The war was over. Her life, their life together, was just beginning.